good old Jean Koning. I don't remember the night that Perry Bellegarde spoke, and Jean Koning, who was a very ancient activist, she's in her 80s, Carol, maybe she's a bit older. Jean, she got up and said, I don't want to embarrass you, Perry, but I have a question to ask. She said, you met the Prime Minister a week or so ago and you talked to him. Do you think he gets it? Which was as blunt as you could possibly get. And Perry, of course, responded, I was pitching and he wasn't catching. And that obviously has been going on after that. And then we had Jennifer Preston, of course, from the Quakers, and Paul Joff, the constitutional lawyer who works in international law and international relations, who is going to morph. Well, that's not true, really. One of our graduate students told him she was going to grow up and be him. So he's soon going to disappear into Meyer Gunnarsson, who is going back to Montreal to haunt him, I think. Although I told her Peter was also in the field of Aboriginal law, so she may be headed to Vancouver next. Then we had Ellen Gabriel, who came up to talk about Oka and to talk about the continuing pressure, obviously, from resource development and pipeline building in her particular area of the country. I felt kind of sad because for those of you who are at the paper, you know that at one point Ellen had trouble going on, and I spoke to her after and said, look, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. And she did confess that she'd been struggling over the emotional impact, the psychological impact of this. She said to me, having people point guns at you and fire their bullets. And she said, I've been struggling with that for years. So she did us a really good favor to come here and to speak despite dragging that around with her. It's obviously a burden she's never going to be able to put down. We're ending the series, of course, on really a high point with Peter Brandt coming out of Vancouver to speak to us this evening on Keewatin. That's how we're pronouncing it. Jade. Is that right or wrong? Jade's from kind of Taglish, and she knows how to pronounce it. I think I'm always wrong pronouncing it, but to speak to us about the Tsilhqotin and the Keewatin decisions. The Supreme Court got one right and got one wrong, and we can talk about that later. It's kind of embarrassing to be at my age and to say I have a great privilege to introduce someone who I had admired from afar for a considerable period of time. This man has dedicated his life to Aboriginal First Nations causes and has made, to say the least, considerable contributions. It wasn't until his biography was sent in that I realized not only how extensive the career had been, but that it had started with a bang very early on, as early as 1976, wasn't it? When he joined the defense team for Leonard Peltier, just out of law school, right? Get up the big leagues very quickly, and he still, as I quizzed him extensively at dinner, I did allow him to eat. He's still very much involved in the Peltier case, and told me that he's not going to retire till Peltier's out of prison. So he will be one lawyer who works forever, probably, because it doesn't seem that anybody, even quote unquote on the American left, is going to open that gate and let him come out. I thought for a while that Clinton might do it, but that didn't help. It didn't work, excuse me. He did that, and then he moved to the Gitxagan and Wet'suwet'en territory, practiced law, took his family there. More about that later. And he worked as counsel on Delgamuukw from there. A case which we all know of, it went to the Supreme Court. I first ran across him, or I first made a connection with him, because he led one of the earliest residential school cases, the Blackwater versus Plint case. And there were two more of those cases with Plint, but they're not after that. And he still works with issues related to Indian residential schools. He is putting together a class action suit for day scholars that went to residential schools, kids that came into the schools during the day and then went home at night and suffered considerable harm, quite obviously, as they were treated like other children in the classrooms and in the playgrounds. And that was, as we know, difficult. So hopefully, that's in April, is it not? That's going to take the next step forward. Sticking with residential schools, of course, he was part of the negotiating team that brought us the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, and now serves on the National Administration Committee, which overlooks the implementation of that settlement agreement. He's had, and maybe he'll talk about some of it, some clashes with others with respect to how that agreement has been rolled out, and the justices and injustices of the way even the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has tripped up. I was also impressed, and you would be, as many of you are academics, with his long list of publications, public papers, conferences he's gone to. So he is probably a full professor at this point if you have a look at and how much he's done in that sort of academic setting. I think one of the most amazing things about his career, and I've only touched on bits of it, right? He's been everywhere: fishing, resource development, the lumber industry, pipelines. There's not a flashpoint in Aboriginal affairs that he hasn't been at the heart of in one way or the other. One of the more amazing things, of course, is that all of that energy and that whole career is based on a rather fragile intellectual foundation. He has a BA in literature and film. So you have to search around for how he became successful somewhere else, although he tripped me up on that as well, because he has produced a daughter who's a rather good film producer in Toronto. So even in that area, he's been successful, although I put it down to his wife, I must admit. And he's about to become a grandfather for the second time within the last 12 months, I guess. This year. So without any more ado, let me present Peter Grant to talk about Tsilhqotin and Keewatin. And I worry because there's a book here written by John Ralston Saul. So starts talking about that, you are allowed to boo.
Well, thank you very much, John, who I knew as Professor Malloy, who kindly sent me way back in the Blackwater days when I didn't know him, except that he had been the researcher for the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples on this residential school, this small little chapter. We need a little more. He sent me all of the material, several volumes in which I tried to put before the judge in the first residential school case that went to trial, the late Chief Justice Brenner, and Canada and the church lawyer who's now the Chief Justice of British Columbia, Justice Hinkson. They objected strenuously that Dr. Malloy wasn't focused on this one school we were talking about, and were successful. So we're trying it again, and in a few weeks, but I'm not using his whole report. Dr. Malloy presented this other report. I don't know. People ask me, how did you get into this? And I think probably it was Leonard Peltier. When he explained to me what the fight was about, which was about the Black Hills and what AIM was doing at that time, and of course the huge resource exploitation of this sacred area. And as an aside, the reason I could come here was because the case going to the BC Court of Appeal of Spiritual Protection, a case that we lost to protect an area in British Columbia where, in the government and the court's wisdom, a ski resort is more important than a place of huge sacred importance to the Tanaka people, the Kootenai people, who are very private about their spirituality. We lost that, and we were going to the Court of Appeal, and the gauntlet we were throwing down to the Court of Appeal, and it may come back to Ottawa as well, is everybody else has this protection called the Charter, and Section 2A is your freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. However, the way it's being interpreted, and Aboriginal people don't have that, because you got Section 35. So that's how the judge transposed it. We don't really have to talk about Aboriginal religion or freedom of religion under Section 2A, which a charter right has got a high standard of protection. We'll talk about it as a Section 35 right. We are arguing on both grounds. And seeing what the Court of Appeal did in Tsilhqotin in BC, and fortunately the Supreme Court of Canada chastised them politely but firmly. Hopefully they will recognize that maybe they should look at Aboriginal issues a little differently in the Court of Appeal. I want to acknowledge that I understand that I'm in Mississauga territory, and I also want to honor that, because one of the things that's really important that's happened in my career is our knowledge about where we are. And I know I'm speaking to persons in an academic setting who are most often much more sensitive to this. I want to only correct one minor thing of Dr. Malloy, who never makes a mistake. The only mistake he made is that I'm becoming a grandfather for the second time. Actually, it's the third time. In 2015, my wife and I got a hat trick. Our first daughter had twins, and then we were told on December 30th from our second daughter, she said, just in case your year isn't exciting enough, she's having one. So we're going to have 3, which I think will be enough. I also want to say that I'm going to come at this a bit from my own perspective of my own career, and it's certainly not to boast, it's a small piece, but the issue that I have and I guess wrongly, and I won't refer to JRS right away, but I will soon, but is about history, how we are part of history, and there were some things that he said that I thought made sense. I'd like to discuss events. I intervened in Tsilhqotin in the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Tsilhqotin decision is about Aboriginal title. And the Tsilhqotin decision is a huge breakthrough, because it's the first time in Canada that Aboriginal title has been found to exist. And that's quite important, because that means the dynamic has changed dramatically. Certainly in Quebec, several parts of Quebec, outside of the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement area, which covers a huge area, parts of Quebec, British Columbia, and debatably, depending on certain cases that are now before the courts here, the federal court here, in even some parts of Ontario, that they are non-treated areas. And one of the important things is that we are in a treaty country, but what about the non-treated areas? So there's so much I can say and know about BC history that I can speak of, but I want to just focus on certain things. So I would like to talk to you a little bit about, well, how did this start? Like, what was going on here? Events leading up to the Delgamuukw case, the Delgamuukw title case, and as I said in the title is Tsilhqotin and Keewatin come from that, what they came out. I don't know, in my days when I was my father was an historian and I loved history, so, but I was always told I had to memorize dates. So just to put it in context, because I was critiqued when I wrote the paper by a lawyer in my firm about you're jumping around a bit. So I just will start at the beginning, because I will jump around a little bit. But Delgamuukw started. I moved up north in 1977. Freezing cold, 35 below, nothing for here, but I was a Vancouver boy, so it was really cold. And I thought, geez, this is normal life. Well, by the next fall, the highway had washed out, and I was caught on the other side of it. And some of my clients were a little excited about it. I said, I guess this is what happens in the fall here. The highway washes out. Well, they said, no, the highway doesn't normally wash out. So I had some great climatic experiences early on, but it was very cold. It was one of the coldest winters we've had since the 40s. The Delgamuukw case started in 1984. The trial went from 1987 to June of 1990. The trial decision came in March 8th, 1991. International Women's Day, every year International Women's Day, I remember that year. It was the one day in my life that I was going to quit the practice of law. I just thought that it was I had misled 69 chiefs and hundreds of people that there was some kind of justice in this country. The Supreme Court decision came down in 1997. The Tsilhqotin decision of court arguments was started in 1991 and won fruition. Evolved, and it was heard until 2005, from 2001, and the Supreme Court decision came down last summer, and a few weeks later we have what is sometimes referred to in Aboriginal, as referred to as the Grassy Narrows case or the Keewatin case. So, what I have observed in my career, notwithstanding that Leonard is still in prison, solitary confinement, in Florida, is there's been an evolution in our country, and that it is an important concept. And where I was going to refer to John Ralston Saul at the beginning, he talks about history, and he talks about one thing. He says, we're always somewhere in history, struggling in the waves, being dashed on the rocks, or just paddling innocently along. He's writing, I'm sure, not as an historian, but as a philosopher or even as a poet. The point is that we are, and when I read that, I thought, in a way, this is what has happened. I'll just tell you, Delgamuukw. Who was Delgamuukw? Who is Delgamuukw? There were 3 Delgamuuks that I have known. The one now is Romualdo. If you go to Ottawa, the Parliament buildings, the Aboriginal sculptures on the front door, he did one of those. He's an artist, a Gitxsan artist. His brother had been Delgamuukw before him, and he was Delgamuukw for the opening of the trial, and he died within a year, suddenly, of a heart attack. And before that was Albert Tate, and Albert Tate was born in the 1890s, and he died about 3 months before the trial started. The reason the case was known by Delgamuukw is the Gitxsan name there. They decided Delgamuukw was the person. We would sit in a room like this, although not tiered, and I would sit there for days during the preparation in Gitxsan and in Wet'suwet'en, and the chiefs would argue, and it was arguing, and then, but not as we do, they would all speak, but you could tell there was differences as to how we were going to approach Delgamuukw. And they defined the case, and that was the first time that it happened, that it was their perspective that we had to argue. And when we lost so badly in 1991, many Aboriginal lawyers, highly respected lawyers, who had done a lot of work, criticized us and told us to leave it alone because we had argued it wrong. But we had done what we were told by those chiefs and elders, many of whom had lived in the early, were born in the 1800s. Now in northern British Columbia, you have to keep in mind that contact for their neighbors, the Gitxsan, was 1878, 1888. These people, and earliest contact was from in the Wet'suwet'en country, 1820s. These people were being taught by their parents and grandparents, who, one of the first witnesses I had, Martha Brown Cleomaha, described how her mother said, this man came over the hill, and it was a ghost. And this was the first white man that had come into Gitxsan country that she had ever seen. And these were the people that had that depth of knowledge of their territory, of their system of government, and in terms of how they managed it, and the first arrival. So it was really powerful and really honorable to be in that. And when they decided that Delgamuukw would be, Albert Tate would be the named chief, it's because at the end of a whole day, he would stand up. He was about this tall. He was not big, but he went out on the land at 95. He was on the land himself. I mean, his nephews, the present Delgamuukw would want to be with him, but he would just go out on his own, as did the other chiefs. And what he spoke, and all of the other chiefs then agreed. And it's because they spoke from their knowledge of what they knew before. And he knew he had traveled through all the northern territories, so they knew that. So the real fortune I had was to be able to try to transpose this. I'm just going to quote from the opening on May 11, 1987. Keewatin, who was the Wet'suwet'en chief, he just passed away a year ago. Wonderful, wonderful person. He had suffered through the residential schools, but he had also been taught, by persons, elders, including Johnny David, whose evidence I held on commission and whose evidence is videoed. Johnny David was born around 1890. His father, talk about Indian affairs, his father took the family from down by an area near Houston, British Columbia. It was a 2-day ride, and he was a child, and they took them up to the Indian agent's office in Hazelton because they said he had to come up there to sort out some things. And he went there, and he remembers that. And then they went back And when they went back, their place was destroyed and there were fences built. And this was in the course of, over the course of the summer months. The late Dr. Lane gave evidence of what this was all about. The Boer war script. The war script in the Bulkley Valley, that area of Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en country was opened up at that time. So you started to link what the people told you, what their grandparents told them, and what their oral histories, and you started to link that to Western concepts of history and Western concepts of archaeology, and I'll come to something else. But here's what Gisteway says. This was the first words that Chief Justice McEachern heard. My name is Gisteway. I'm a Wet'suwet'en chief and a plaintiff in this case. My house owns territory in Maurice River and Owen Lake. Each Wet'suwet'en chief's house owns several territories. Together we own and govern Wet'suwet'en territory. As an example, this land is owned by Keewatin in Smithers, in Kaya, also known as Chief Voss's house. Then Delgamuukw spoke. For us, the ownership of territories is marriage of chief and land. Each chief has an ancestor who encountered and acknowledged the life of the land. From such encounters come power. The land, the plants, the animals, and people all have spirit. They all must be shown respect. That is the basis of our law. And so this description that they were giving was an effort to translate to the white man's court what they saw and what they lived and they breathed. And they did live and breathe it. I traveled up mountains with men that were 80. I was in my late 20s and I was like an old man. They just went like that. I mean, they were amazing. And it was a breakthrough and an opportunity. And it was an opportunity lost. Because the man who heard it as the judge didn't have the capability of understanding or hearing what was being said to him. So that was the first time when Delgamuukw, it wasn't us saying these words, it was them saying it. They stood up and said it. Another point is this, you may find interesting if you see photographs of things going on around the court at Delgamuukw. Everybody wears regalia, you see all of this. Never wore regalia. Delgamuukw Albert Tate saw what happened on Haida Gwaii at Lyle Island during the protesters. And he saw elders and people of Haida with their regalia on being grabbed by police and arrested. And he said, we will never do this until we are respected. And the first time there was a celebration of the Delgamuukw case by the Gitxsan and the Wet'suwet'en was after December 11th, 1997. And they had a huge celebration with enormous amount of their regalia was brought out. They would not wear it at the court. And that's the transposition. I can talk of the situation that occurred before in 1977, what led up to this. There was a big promise. Then Indian Affairs Minister Hugh Faulkner signed the declaration of the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en on November 11, 1977, recognized that they had a foundation with their declaration of their title to negotiate a treaty. Unfortunately, Canada's policy would only negotiate 6 across the country at that time and only 1 in British Columbia, and that was the Niska one. So 3 years later, these elders and chiefs said, it doesn't matter what we do to prepare. They did a lot of preparation for treaty negotiation. The government will not recognize us. So I just want to say what I see as the foundation of title for you, and I know you've had other scholars here that have probably spoken a lot about this, but really what is title? It's the, and we'll come back to this with Tsilhqotin, it's the right to use and control the land and to enjoy, quote, economic fruits of the land. It comes with the obligation to protect it for future generations so they're able to use and enjoy the land in the same way. So while Aboriginal rights allow the rights holders to hunt fish or gather rowan kelp, the right to control of the land is complete. This means you can use it for whatever you wish. You can manage the resources so long as you're protecting it for future generations. Now, the elders and chiefs told us in Delgamuukw to claim ownership and jurisdiction. That was one of the issues that came up and why it was sent back on a procedural basis for a new trial. But the reason they did that was because they said, we have the right to protect the land. And that was what, translating that into English, Canadian, Anglo-Canadian law, that was the closest to which it was. So that's why they saw Delgamuukw as a success in the Supreme Court of Canada. But let's go back before Faulkner's declaration, and in the Supreme Court in Sparrow summarized what had happened. And that is that for 50 years, they talk about after the publication of Clements, the law of the Canadian Constitution, 1916, there was a virtual absence of discussion of any kind of Indian rights to land in academic literature. By the late 1960s, Aboriginal claims were not even recognized by the federal government to have any legal status. Some of you here may recall the flurry of activity after 1968, Trudeau mania, and it was going to be a wide opening, a just society, and Trudeau himself had to deal with this issue very soon on in 1969 because the Nisga's took the Calder case, and he said, this is what he said in Vancouver on August 8, 1969. I think Canadians are not proud of their past in the way in which they treated the Indian population of Canada, and I don't think we have very great cause to be proud. And I'm saddened because when you look at the legacy of what he said there about this lack of pride and acknowledgement of the wrong, you can go to 2008 with the apology on the residential school, and you see the Prime Minister in the House making a hugely moving statement that many of my clients and thousands of Aboriginal people across the country took to heart. But this is what Trudeau then goes on to say. At least he finished with what he really thought. He talks about keeping the treaty promises. That was in 1969. We are still battling that, as you see. But Aboriginal rights, he says, this really means saying, this is Trudeau, we were here before you. You came and took the land from us, and perhaps you cheated us by giving us some worthless things in return for vast expanses of land, and we want to reopen this question. We want you to preserve our Aboriginal rights and restore them to us, end quote. And our answer, this is Trudeau, it may not be the right one, and it may not be the one which is accepted, but it will be up to all of you people to make up your minds and to choose for or against it and discuss it with the Indians. Our answer is no. No, there is no title. So what happened is that when the Supreme Court of Canada 3-3-1, and they set aside the Niska decision on a procedural ground, classic. The Supreme Court of Canada set aside Delgamuukw on a procedural ground, trial judge in Tsilhqotin did it on a procedural ground. They always dodged the bullet. They always would not make the final statement. But what they did say is Aboriginal title exists in this country in 1973, and to his credit, Trudeau recognized they had to change policy, and that's where treaty making started. But we come a long way, and I think it's because not just of the legal battles, but what I was telling you about the elders and the knowledge. It's about the Aboriginal leaders and that they have pushed for the recognition of rights and title and treaty rights. They continue that struggle today, seeking recognition within the Canadian legal framework of their title. So one small portion of British Columbia now is controlled by the Tsilhqotin. But the principles the court has set out have made it absolutely clear that the province of British Columbia, Quebec and untreated land, and other areas, make decisions at their peril at this stage, because unless they have the consent or agreement of the Aboriginal nation whose territory it is in. So, going back to what happened in Calder, the court said, in terms of title, the fact is when settlers came, the Indians were there, organized in societies. Organized in societies. This is very important, because people think title is just about land. Title is about government. Title is about decision making. It's a whole structure. It's a society. It's a civilization. My late father came one day to Delgamuukw. I'll never forget. We went out for lunch and he sat in the courtroom. As I said, he was an historian. And then he sat and he talked to me, and he knew I'd put everything into this case and was immersed in it. And he said, "There's something wrong." He said, "This is wrong." And I said to him, what do you mean? And he'd been watching the judge, and just briefly for 1 or 2 days, and he said, no one man, there's something wrong with a system where one man is going to judge a civilization. That's wrong. And I always thought of that afterwards when I saw that judgment, because it's beyond the right or the capability to do so. But why did the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en take it to court? Not to prove they didn't know who they were, but to get the non-Aboriginal, the Crown, to recognize what they had. That's because that denial has been, of course, the legacy of this country. And we're still paying for it. Now, the issue about title, I just want to say, Aboriginal title involves occupation. It involves that land was occupied prior to sovereignty. There's continuity between present and pre-sovereignty occupation, and at sovereignty, the occupation must have been exclusive. This is the assertion of sovereignty. And there's a question about that. But how does that mean? And I was having this debate in the context of some other work we're doing. When the white men arrived on the East Coast, they met these peoples, and what are you doing here? And these people said, this is our land, we welcome you in. This was the foundation of treaty making. We will allow you to be in, but under our rules. So the concept, and this is a real problem, because Aboriginal people says, how do they get sovereignty? And of course, we had that huge debate within Delgamuukw, because the Gitxsan would not agree that the Crown controlled all of the lands and resources, but it was only vis-a-vis European nations. The British, if the Gitxsan are going to negotiate a treaty, they will not negotiate it with the Russians or the Americans, they'll negotiate it with the Crown. That is the sole criteria, that's the sole issue. But the question is that who occupied the land when the white men arrived? Who, if you did, do you still occupy it in a continuity? The Supreme Court in Tsilhqotin went very much further, and it explained a lot of this. You're supposed to give me a 5-minute warning or something?
I don't even know when
I forgot to, I'm still on VC time in my watch, so I think I have 3 hours. But I will keep track. So, the Supreme Court dealt with each of these elements, but just keeping that in mind, these elements are critical. Now this is where I'm going to be, I see my young associate saying, Peter, don't do it. I want to talk about oral histories though, because oral histories are so critical to this. And one of the problems is that oral histories are not from a Western concept, and they have to be looked at. You have to get out of our head to what they're doing. If I fought one battle in Delgamuukw, I mean, I was involved in all parts of it, but I fought to the Supremes the oral recognition of oral histories. Now let me just tell you how we established, because the only way we figured we could get this into a judge's head is you translate it and let's use some Western concept. So here's the oral history about the Medik. The Medik is a giant grizzly bear. It came and destroyed an entire village, the central village of the Gitxsan. The evidence was presented by Aunt Galilibek's Mary Johnson in the early days, and she describes for punishment, these young girls had started to play with the fish bones and use them for adornment where they're not supposed to, at this lake, which is still there. It's now called City Lake. It's below this huge mountain, and there's this beautiful lake. Then it goes down to the Skeena River. Across the Skeena River is the location of the ancient village site of Tamlaham, or Damlahamet. So, in 1936, the late Walter Wright, one of the elders who was alive then, described this event. As it came, this is about the Medik, It came through the forest, was torn apart, trees uprooted, trampled down, a wide gash in greenery told of its passing. Closer and still closer to the river came the turmoil, and last a bear came out on the river's margin. A bear, but unlike any bear the people had ever seen. A giant grizzly bear, one capable of uprooting trees, snapping giant trunks as though they were grasses. Paused, the bear paused, and glared across the river at Tsilhqotin. He moved down the bank, entered the water. The chief called the warriors. They picked up their spears 20 foot long. They were strong weapons, but they went forward to defeat. A knock knock, knock knock is a spiritual power. A knock knock, no less confronted them. But that spirit, from that spirit animal, the arrows bounced, sped into the air, and fell to kill and wound defenders. The sharp spear points were useless. The cedar shafts broke in the hands of the warriors. And through the confusion, the giant grizzly bear moved like the wind. On haunches he walked with four paws swinging. Each time he hit the head of a man, the head was smashed from the body. Into this peaceful scene came the fear. This was about the Tsilhqotin, a description. The unseemly events were taking place far back in the forest, and this is a further description. The story is repeated by Walter Wright. It's repeated a couple of times, but it's always the story about what happened. That story was told to Justice Tsilhqotin, the Chief Justice, and a year later, Dr. Goddesfell, a geologist, and Dr. Matthews, a paleobotanist, testified. There was a massive slide at this location 3,680 years ago. It was drilled down into the lake, and we proved the timing of it. So Dr. Goddesfell was asked what he would have seen if he was standing across the river when this event occurred. This is his evidence, the geologist. Well, if you could see the mountain from where you were standing, there would be a tremendous noise, overwhelming loud noise, a great cloud of material, swaths of forest being cleared as the debris slide came down across Chicago Creek fan. I envisioned the debris turning where lots of water was incorporated, and there would be this great mud-charged mess of material coming down the valley, great rolled wall of brown material, trees tossed around, a swath of countryside being cleared that would come towards you. I'm sure you'd be frightened and run away. The court asked, like an avalanche, only a different color and different material? Yes, really an impressive event that you would see. I'll never forget, the judge took off his glasses and he said, "Are you talking about what was told to me a year and a half ago?" The penny dropped. However, when he came to his decision, he found that the oral histories were merely recollections of Aboriginal life. He did not tie that 3,680 years ago an event occurred, which, by the way, we had to persuade the elders we could describe some scientific evidence, because this was not a landslide. This was a Medik. This was the grizzly bear. And that's the point about different worldviews. And that's part of the clash that I think that I saw that we have to try to face. Now, in 2007, Justice Vickers in Tsilhqotin, he looks at this and he says this, taking from the Supreme Court decision about oral histories, a court must take into account the perspective of Aboriginal people claiming the right, while at the same time taking into the perspective of Aboriginal law. He says, oral accounts of the past include a good deal of subjective experience. They are not simply a detached recounting of factual events, but are rather facts enmeshed in the stories of a lifetime. They are also likely to be rooted in particular locations, making reference to particular families and communities. In a fact-driven process such as determination of rights and title, one must sift through the layers of oral history and oral tradition evidence with an awareness of context and an appreciation of the role of that tradition within Aboriginal society. That is the Supreme Court speaking, commenting on Justice Vickers and on what had happened earlier with Justice Tsilhqotin. So we have two histories, or multiple histories. We have different histories of different nations. If you compared the Tsilhqotin's oral history to the Gitxsan, it would be quite different, because of the whole nature of their society is different. And the risk that persons thought after Delgamuukw was that we had set such a high standard for oral histories that nobody else would be able to establish them, because the Delgamuukw histories, the Adawk and the Konga, they were so well documented in the early 1900s that a lot of them are extant by William Barbeau and by Marius Barbeau and William Bainham. So, but the important thing is that Justice Vickers, unlike Justice McEachern, saw the value and recognized and was prepared to put his ear to what they were trying to tell him. He also recognized what the Supreme Court said in Delgamuukw. This is Vickers in Tsilhqotin. He also recognized reconciliation as the goal, as Chief Justice Lemaire said at the end. That's the goal. But reconciliation means you have to start with recognition, who they are. And as John Nelson Saul summarizes in a chapter about denial of justice, the Crown continuously denies people's existence as a people. And that goes on to today. And you just shake your head. You just shake your head. So, I'm just going to take you to a few other points from the trial judgment. Justice Vickers implemented a definition of the title from Delgamuukw, and he applied it to them, that it is unique to the Tsilhqotin. So unlike the Gitxsan, if you all probably have a much better sense of BC's geography than I do of Ontario's, but Gitxsan are on the Skeena River. They're inland on the Skeena River. They are the wealth, they are, quote, Northwest culture, and relate to the Tsimshian, same language group. They are based on the fishery. Inland from them is the Wet'suwet'en, and they utilize the salmon fishery as well. But the Wet'suwet'en would use much wider spans of territory further inland and came out for the fishery in the summers. As the Gitxsan went and used the land as well. But their language is completely different. And the Wet'suwet'en are part of the Carrier, the Athabascan speaking group. Any of you that have looked at any linguistics, there's a famous book which is very difficult to read. We had linguists who did it, but the late David Aberley, who studied Carrier language and established through linguistics that that's one of the oldest languages. It came down through the Yukon, and I was down in Navajo country, and I went to Shiprock, and there are these names, and I recognize them because they're the same names as are in Hagilgut, the same spelling and the same words. That language group, the Carrier, came all the way down, and because the Cree in Canada came out, are across the prairies, that's not maybe not as widely known, but the Carrier language is very, very strong. The point is that this affects how they see the world. So the Wet'suwet'en Kunga are often in songs. The Gitxsan have songs as well, but their oral histories are Adawk, and they are spoken. So, but they were both more, in a Western concept, more settled when you look at the Tsilhqotin, and the fight on the Tsilhqotin case was they were nomads. And nomads don't have title, because they wander around the land. So what you had from the BC Court of Appeal is what we call the postage stamp view. I call it the pogo stick view of title. That they had village sites. And if they had a place like the parallel would be a buffalo jump where they would catch large animals, that would have title. They'd have title there, they'd have title there. And I'd say pogo stick because you'd have to hop from one place to the other. The BC Court of Appeal rejected that they had title, found on the basis of a Supreme Court decision in Bernard and Marshall that the Tsilhqotin just had this postage stamp view of title. People were extremely afraid. Within the Aboriginal legal community, there were a lot of discussions about them taking the appeal up. Remember, the Supreme Court that ruled on that case unanimously had 6 appointees of this present government on the Supreme Court. And we know they weren't necessarily all on the Aboriginal side of issues. Chief Justice McLaughlin had been on the Delgamuukw court. She, of course, replaced Chief Justice Lemaire, but it was really a debate as to what would happen. And the BC Court of Appeal decision is very well reasoned and is very careful. And it relies on a case out of the Maritimes, two cases, Bernard and Marshall. Let me just tell you a little bit about how you prove evidence. You know, some of the worst cases that have happened, including on religious freedom, have been with shotgun approach about we can just put in a little evidence. The key is the findings of fact of the trial judge. In these two cases, Bernard and Marshall, they were talking about the right to log timber. We tried to intervene in those cases that were heard in 2005 on the basis of title. And they said, no, the Supreme Court said, no, it's a maritime treaty case. Forget it. You guys stay away. The court then found and overturned the Courts of Appeal of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and found that they did not have title and that they could not prove title because of the length of occupation. They claimed most of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in those two respective cases, encompassing where the trees were to be cut. But they relied not just on a treaty right, but they relied on title. But they didn't have evidence of what the people did. The trial judge found there was little evidence of title and threw it out. Court of Appeal reversed the judge and said we have to be more generous, we have to be more careful. Supreme Court of Canada, Chief Justice McLaughlin said no. I always maintained, and I was not agreed with by lawyers I really respect, I always maintained right up to the intervention that we did in Tsilhqotin that it was because Justice McLaughlin saw there was no basis in fact for title in those two cases that she said we can't talk about this. Of course, the Tsilhqotin they had, and that's what she did. She said no, there's a foundation, and what the trial judge did in Tsilhqotin is he used our test and he said the Tsilhqotin have title to this area. And then, of course, what did he do? He said because the map got amended procedurally, I'm not going to give them title. And the Supreme Court of Canada threw out procedural defenses. She said it's a time to stop with procedural defenses because we're never going to get reconciliation for either Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal people if we keep saying you've got title but come back to us another day. So that was one of the key elements in the case that I think really affected how the Supreme Court dealt with Marshall and Bernard. And I was very happy about that because I said we intervened for the Wet'suwet'en and I intervened for the Gitmeow, who were neighbors to the Gitxsan, and we're representing them in a title case now. They are between they're Gitxsan speaking, but they are an independent nation between the Gitxsan and the Niska. I can tell you a whole other story about why they didn't join they participated in those discussions, but they did not join the case because all of their chiefs were sent to prison when the reserves were created, and they said we are the only people that never accepted reserves, and they had one tiny reserve imposed on them, of course, and they name it after the location where the chiefs were taken. They call it the Ocala Prison Reserve. Ocala's in New Westminster, and they still say the Ocala Prison Reserve. So the key I want to say about occupation is that the first part, the Supreme Court really grappled with this nomadic concept. And they say this on the first part. They say there's no suggestion in jurisprudence or scholarship that Aboriginal title is confined to specific village sites or farms, as the Court of Appeal held. Rather, a culturally sensitive approach suggests that regular use of territories for hunting, fishing, trapping, and foraging is, quote, sufficient, end quote, use to grant Aboriginal title, provided that such use on the facts of each case evinces an intention to hold or possess the land in a manner comparable to what we require to establish titles in common law. And they compared it to the common law concept that you have, fee simple with your house on it, but you don't go into your backyard. No, that's not yours because you're not living there. And that's what the Court of Appeal effectively did. If you're not living right there on the postage stamp, you're out. And they said that's not even how we look at occupation and control of land. So they thoroughly rejected that. And then they said this, and this is important because for those of you who want to move this area of law forward, this is part of what still has to be recognized. We argued for the right of self-government as part of title in Delgamuukw. Tsilhqotin did not, but it is a critical element of it. And it says, in other words, the court has to look at the particular laws, systems, and governance of the Aboriginal group, how they occupy and use the land, and the character in which the land is asserted. So basically, it's very important not to just say, oh yeah, this is what we did, but to have the detail of what you know, how you govern the land. And the Tsilhqotin successfully did that for a large portion of their land. The court rejected Bernard and Marshall. It didn't reject that case, but said that's not what we're talking about. So, if the court found title, and then it went on to say that title confers ownership rights similar to those associated with fee simple, including the right to decide how the land will be used, the right of enjoyment and occupancy, the right to possess the land, the right to economic benefits of the land, and the right to proactively use and manage the land. The court found that the trees in Tsilhqotin territory of title land were not crown timber. They were Tsilhqotin timber. They were Aboriginal timber. And so the resources do not belong to the crown. So the court said they have to get consent, but if there's some overriding urgent reason to use Aboriginal title land, of course they always are saying, you know, there might be something that comes up, you can do this, but you do it at your peril. And one of the critical things the court said is that if the government chooses to license a third party, and for those of you who haven't heard about it, there's this little project in the north called Northern Gateway, the Enbridge project. If it licenses it and title is found, the government may have to revoke that decision, and the third party should be on notice of that. So what this means is that there's enormous power and authority for Aboriginal groups if they wish to use it, and that is a key element of the case. The other point is that the court has built up this concept of the honor of the crown in the Manitoba Métis case, where the Métis were denied their rights, and it was fought all the way to the Supreme Court and succeeded in the Supreme Court after being lost in Manitoba about their script was being denied them. The court, they wanted a declaration of their rights, and the court said the honor of the crown requires the crown to maintain its promises, to keep its promises. So this honor of the crown is starting to get built up in Canadian law. But once you have title, the crown has a complete fiduciary obligation to protect your interest as against the third party's interest. Now I say this, and I'm sure, sometimes I'm on panels with counsel for industry and they say, oh, Peter's overstating it and things like that. And I have to tell you that because that's what they say. But when you read the judgment, that's what the court is saying. They are at their peril. Those advising industry are of two minds. Some are telling them that, and some are saying, no, don't worry, it's all the same. The crown can interfere when it wants to. But that's not what the court had said. So, in the Wet'suwet'en and the Gitsan's case was set back for trial. The Wet'suwet'en, we intervened in the Supreme Court of Canada. The Wet'suwet'en also intervened in a case brought by the Tsilhqotin for breach of their treaty rights. Not treaty rights, of their treaty negotiations. The Crown was negotiating with this group on Vancouver Island for a treaty. Meanwhile, they'd alienated all their land, like they had hardly any land. They took it to the Inter-American Court for Human Rights, and Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and the Tsilhqotin and the Wet'suwet'en intervened. And the Wet'suwet'en went through chapter and verse from 1977, the Hugh Faulkner Declaration, Delgamuukw through trial of 3 years, Delgamuukw to the Court of Appeal, Supreme Court of Canada, and after that, the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en have been negotiating a treaty, and what have they got? They've got no treaty. They have nothing. And they showed that the Canadian courts had not, up to that stage, had not recognized title anywhere. Canada said, yes, there's title, and everybody was, you know, we were fair to Aboriginal people, but they hadn't recognized it. We put that before the Supreme Court of Canada. And as counsel for the Assembly of First Nations said, Joe Arvey, who I know, he said, it's now or never to the Supreme Court. You guys, you know, enough is enough. If they haven't proven it, it's all theoretical. And I think that was very important, that the court recognizes that internationally, and by the way, in the Hulkameelum intervention, the declaration was given that they had standing because there was very little chance of the Hulkameelum proving title, because the Canadian courts, although they recognized it existed, they hadn't found it anywhere. So those kinds of pressures are also brought to bear, and the Supreme Court knew it because we intervened and brought that forward to them. In case industry or government isn't clear, the court said, after saying that they may have to revoke decisions, said, I add this: governments and individuals proposing to use or exploit land, whether before or after a declaration of title, can avoid a charge of infringement or failure to adequately consult by obtaining the consent of the interested Aboriginal group. So the court was very clear about this. The court then went on to talk about, in Tsilhqotin, about federal provincial, but I just want to briefly refer to Keewatin. As you know, that case came down a few weeks later. From 1888 on, the St. Catherine's Milling case, the law was pretty clear. Jurisdiction over the question of title and the right to make treaties and the obligations under treaties was a Crown responsibility, was federal Crown responsibility. The plaintiffs, the Aboriginal plaintiffs in Keewatin, they said that Ontario couldn't do certain things with this treaty, and there were complexities of the treaty because of boundary disputes and other issues that I won't go into, but it's referred to in describing the case. But they won't. But Ontario didn't really have jurisdiction. It had to get federal consent as well to approve projects within the treaty lands, not reserve lands, the balance of the treaty lands. Well, what I liked about what the court says and where they started is they put the Treaty 3 in context, and they said, and this goes to our good friend whose birthday was celebrated, John A. Macdonald. In the early 1870s, Canada was a young country looking to promote Western expansion and confederation. Settlers traveled west along an immigrant travel route called the Dawson Route. British Columbia agreed to join Confederation on condition Canada build a transcontinental railway. But the immigrant travel route and the prospective railway to the west ran through traditional Ojibwe land and was now northwestern Ontario and eastern Manitoba. Canada was concerned about the security of immigrant travelers and surveyors preparing for the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, and feared it may need to station troops in the area. Securing a safe route through the Ojibwe lands was critical for the addition of British Columbia to Confederation and the development of the West. It was against this historical background that Treaty 3, which is the heart of the case, was negotiated. Every treaty, from the time of the 1609, the first treaties were happening on the East Coast through to the Great Peace of Montreal, to this. The Aboriginal people had the upper hand, and they were negotiating these treaties with solemn promises. The issue that we have today is that these treaty promises are not being fulfilled and are being minimized. So the court recognized in last July that historical context, and that is an improvement because that's a help to understand why treaties have to be dealt with on such a solemn basis. Now, the court then did a bit of a flip. It said the treaty promises were promises of the Crown, not just Canada. So the Crown is, for the legal concept, quote, indivisible. Some things the provinces can do, some things the federal government can do, but the Crown is indivisible. And so the court said those obligations flow to Ontario. Now, it was a loss for the Grassy Narrows because they said they had to go to Canada. But I'm going to say it wasn't a loss because the obligations, I just talked to you about fiduciary obligations where title land is. Those fiduciary obligations, those breach of treaty rights, now it's not just Canada, who of course within our constitutional division of powers doesn't control most of the land and resources. The provinces do, at least south of 60. Canada isn't the only one to be at the table. The provinces are the same obligation. The province is at risk if it violates the treaty rights. It's at risk if it does not take into account and address the Aboriginal issues. And I'm not talking about the 2004 Haida decision, just a mere consultation and accommodation. I call it that because that's how it's treated by the governments. I'm talking about upholding a fiduciary obligation. So I say, and so the court, it's interesting that the court in Keewatin summarizes the legal basis into the province of Ontario to take up the lands under Treaty 3 and the duties it bounds. In exercising its jurisdiction over the Treaty 3 lands, the province of Ontario is bound by the duties attendant on the Crown. The harvesting rights of the Ojibwe over the land must be respected. The Crown must inform, not may, must inform itself. It's not a duty on the Ojibwe. The Crown must inform itself of the impact the province will have on the exercise of their rights and communicate its findings to them, and it must deal with the Ojibwe in good faith and with the intention of substantially addressing their concerns. Back in 1999, I took a case for the Gitnyaw. I'm saying treaties are good, but here I was fighting treaties. Well, the Niska were claiming a bunch of their treaty right, they were getting rights to harvest throughout a bunch of the Gitnyaw territory. And we took it to court because the governments of Canada and British Columbia were negotiating both the Niska and with the Gitnyaw in treaty at that time in 1999. They said, it's like, you know, I said to the judge, like, I have a car, I'm going to sell it to you, and then I'm going to go across the street and sell it to the other person. I'll get for full value. Like, you can't do it. And of course, Canada and BC's lawyers didn't like that, and they tried to show they were being good. But the judge said, and we used labor law analogies, that there's a duty to good faith, a duty of not bargain, not sharp practices. And the Crown, when engaged in treaty negotiations, must do that. The Supreme Court of Canada has found that. And so good faith isn't just, it's a legal concept, it's not just, let's be nice to each other. It has legal obligations and implications. So, I laughed when I read that, and I haven't written, because I want to talk to some of my other colleagues, but I haven't published, but I say, Ontario, you may have won the battle, but you've lost the war, not just for yourself, but for all the other provinces. And the courts are now, because the McLaughlin Court, or the Supreme Court of Canada, sees a lot of dealing with the provinces as well as the federal government in terms of its negotiations. So I just want to make some closing comments. I mentioned at the beginning about John Ralston Saul that we're always somewhere in history, some struggling in the waves, being dashed on the rocks, or just paddling innocently along. I think there's going to be a lot more struggling and dashing into rocks on these issues, both legally and politically. But I think that as in the 1600s, when the Haudenosaunee and the Iroquois made the Two-Row Wampum Treaty, that is an objective that we should look towards. And we have to educate ourselves on this. The other thing I was going to say at the beginning, because I just want to make this comment now, that in my conclusion, that in my view, that it doesn't matter for the students, the grad students, where you go in terms of your career. In Canada, education, medicine, law, history, environmental science, or political science, or economic development. It doesn't matter. These issues about Crown Aboriginal relations are going to hit you. They are going to be there. And it's going to be, it's a reality in our country now. And I say that when I went, when I went to law school,
Sorry, I don't know how to work this thing.
oh, I'm supposed to stop now.
Someone's
The
calling.
pub is closing?
No, just someone called. I apologize.
Thank you.
Talk to your wife.
When I went to law school, the most progressive law school for inclusion, for affirmative action for Aboriginal law students in the country was UBC. And I ended up going there. And that was because UBC had an affirmative action policy that every year there would be an Aboriginal law student. And there was. Fortunately, the guy I knew who was an Army year, he dropped out. I think he dropped out after first year, so our year didn't have an Aboriginal student. That was the view of progressive, that's where it was at that stage. And I guess I'm dating myself. But it also, there was one book coming in Mickenburg on Aboriginal rights in Canada. I still have it in my office. And that was the whole book on Aboriginal law in Canada. And you talk to people about Aboriginal law, and they, well, no, what are you going to do? Bank and court? What are you doing? Oh, I think I'll do, I don't know. And there was no such thing, you know. And it's very interesting. I go back finally to, I'll never forget it, in a tiny court in Hazelton. It's the size of, it was to the end of that table there from here. That was the whole courtroom. And there we were, crowded, and Delgamuukw, Albert Tate was there. It wasn't the Delgamuukw case. It was, I was a young lawyer, and I go into court, and the judge was closer than John is to me. And Albert was caught in his truck out on the land, and his gun was loaded. So this conservation officer, who was very enthusiastic and also was about 4 foot, literally was 4'5", like the guy had a complex, he arrested him for having a loaded firearm and shooting out of season and everything else. And the judge said to me, well, Mr. Grant, what do you know? And the judge was an ex-police commissioner from Southern Rhodesia, moved from there to Northern BC. I just say he did have a clear picture of Aboriginal Crown relations. He said, Mr. Grant, what is your defense? I said, we admit the gun's loaded, we admit all this, but I said he has Aboriginal rights to hunt. And the judge looked at me, and he said to the prosecutor, what do you say? He says, there is no such thing as Aboriginal rights in this country. And at that point in time, without proving everything, you could not even prove an Aboriginal right to hunt. And we fought the case anyway, and I had to deal with the judge on racist grounds to get him off the case and other cases. But I just want to say that things have advanced, although those that I keep working with and keep saying, Peter, what's the hope of this case? They think I'm a little crazy, but I think things have advanced, but it can't be stopped, and we see this with how governments behave. We see what after the 2008 apology of the residential school, what we have. That's a whole other thing I can talk to you about. The government of Canada has retrenched and keeps denying people, survivors, claims now on grounds that 5 years ago there was no dispute. There's all this kind of, we have to be alert, and to advance these, you have to be proactive. And finally, why did I do Aboriginal law? Well, what I learned, it was from my tax law course. In tax law, which I didn't really want to do, actually, as John said, I want to be a filmmaker. That's why I went to law school. I thought I'd do something that, I can make some money while I want to do what I want to do. But anyway, in tax, I realized law is unlike medicine or other things. You're going to be for those who's got or for those that don't got. And that's what I learned in law school. And I thought, well, this is the battleground in this country at this time. So I hope that, I don't know if there's questions, but those are my comments.
There's none questions, right? He's going to open that gate and let him come out. I thought for a while that Clinton might do it, but that didn't help. It didn't work, excuse me. He did that, and then he moved to the Tsilhqotin territory, practiced law, took his family there. More about that later. And he worked as counsel on Delgamuukw from there. A case which we all know of, it went to the Supreme Court. I first ran across him, or I first made a connection with him because He led one of the earliest residential school cases, the Blackwater versus Plint case. And there were 2 more of those cases with Plint, but they're not after that. And he still works with issues related to Indian residential schools. He is putting together a class action suit for day scholars that went to residential schools, kids that came into the schools during the day and then went home at night and suffered considerable harm, quite obviously, as they were treated like other children in the classrooms and in the playgrounds. And that was, as we know, difficult. So hopefully, that's in April, is it not? That's going to take the next step forward. Sticking with residential schools, of course, he was part of the negotiating team that brought us the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, and now serves on the National Administration Committee, which overlooks the implementation of that settlement agreement. He's had, and maybe he'll talk about some of it, some clashes with others with respect to how that agreement has been rolled out, and the justices and injustices of the way even the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has tripped up. I was also impressed, and you would be, as many of you are academics, with his long list of publications, public papers, conferences he's gone to. So he is probably a full professor at this point, if you have a look at how much he's done in that sort of academic setting. I think one of the most amazing things about this career, and I've only touched on bits of it, right? He's been everywhere: fishing, resource development, the lumber industry, pipelines. There's not a flashpoint in Aboriginal affairs that he hasn't been at the heart of in one way or the other. One of the more amazing things, of course, is that all of that energy and that whole career is based on a rather fragile intellectual foundation. He has a BA in literature and film. So you have to search around for how he became successful somewhere else, although he tripped me up on that as well, because he has produced a daughter who's a rather good film producer in Toronto. So even in that area, he's been successful, although I put it down to his wife, I must admit. And he's about to become a grandfather for the 2nd time within the last 12 months, I guess. This year. So without any more ado, let me present Peter Grant to talk about Tsilhqotin and Keewatin. And I worry because there's a book here written by John Ralston Saul. So starts talking about that, you are allowed to boo.
Well, thank you very much, John. Who I knew as Professor Malloy, who kindly sent me way back in the Blackwater days when I didn't know him, except that he had been the researcher for the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples on this residential school, this small little chapter. We need a little more. And he sent me all of the material, several volumes, in which I tried to put before the judge in the first residential school case that went to trial, the late Chief Justice Brenner, and Canada and the church lawyer who's now the Chief Justice of British Columbia, Justice Hinkson, they objected strenuously that Dr. Malloy wasn't focused on this one school we were talking about, and were successful. So we're trying it again, and in a few weeks, but I'm not using his whole report. Dr. Malloy presented this other report. I don't know. People ask me, how did you get into this? And I think probably it was Leonard Peltier. When he explained to me what the fight was about, which was about the Black Hills and what AIM was doing at that time, and of course the huge resource exploitation of this sacred area. And as an aside, the reason I could come here was because the case going to the BC Court of Appeal of Spiritual Protection, a case that we lost to protect an area in British Columbia where, in the government and the court's wisdom, a ski resort is more important than a place of huge sacred importance.
To come here and to speak despite dragging that around with her, it's obviously a a burden she's never going to be able to put down. We're ending the series, of course, on really a high point, with Peter Brandt coming out of Vancouver to speak to us this evening on Keewatin, that's how we're pronouncing it, Jade. Is that right or wrong? Jade's from kind of Taglish, and she knows how to pronounce it. I think I'm always wrong pronouncing it, but to speak to us about the Tsilhqotin and the Keewatin decisions. Supreme Court got one right and got one wrong, and we can talk about that later. It's kind of embarrassing to be at my age and to say I have a great privilege to introduce someone who I had admired from afar for a considerable period of time. This man has dedicated his life to Aboriginal First Nations causes and has made, to say the least, considerable contributions. It wasn't until his biography was sent in that I realized not only how extensive the career had been, but that it had started with a bang very early on, as early as 1976, wasn't it? When he joined the defense team for Leonard Peltier, just out of law school, right? Get up to the big leagues very quickly, and he still, as I quizzed him extensively at dinner, I did allow him to eat. He's still very much involved in the Peltier case, and told me that he's not going to retire till Peltier's out of prison. So he will be one lawyer who works forever, probably, because it doesn't seem that anybody, even quote unquote on the American left. Good old Jean Koning, I don't remember the night that Perry Bellegarde spoke, and Jean Koning, who was a very ancient activist, she's in her 80s, Carol, maybe she's a bit older. Jean, she got up and said, I don't want to embarrass you, Perry, but I have a question to ask. She said, you met the Prime Minister a week or so ago and you talked to him. Do you think he gets it? Which was as blunt as you could possibly get. And Perry, of course, responded, I was pitching and he wasn't catching. And that obviously has been going on after that. And then we had Jennifer Preston, of course, from the Quakers, and Paul Joff, the constitutional lawyer who works in international law and international relations, who is going to morph. Well, that's not true, really. One of our graduate students told him she was going to grow up and be him. So he's soon going to disappear into Meyer Gunnarsson, who is going back to Montreal to haunt him, I think. Although I told her Peter was also in the field of Aboriginal law, so she may be headed to Vancouver next. Then we had Ellen Gabriel, who came up to talk about Oka and to talk about the continuing pressure, obviously, from resource development and pipeline building in her particular area of the country. I felt kind of sad because for those of you who are at the paper, you know that at one point Ellen had trouble going on, and I spoke to her after and said, look, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. And she did confess that she'd been struggling over the emotional impact, the psychological impact of this. She said to me, having people point guns at you and fire their bullets. And she said, I've been struggling with that for years. So she did us a really good favor.